why not? I'm just taking care of the boat getting too shaky. You have something to...
You have something to film?
Yeah.
Not even a GoPro?
Archimedes and Aerides were inflated in the mid-morning sun at the shore of Helensee Lake in Germany. There was almost no wind. The two voluminous aerostatic sculptures lifted cautiously into the air like two fragile creatures absorbing the sun's eager rays. For some time, they drifted. The launch team checked payloads, craned their necks at incoming clouds, and speculated about the wind and the weather. "We are relearning how to float in the air," Thomas Saraceno said. Then, almost without warning, Archimedes and Aerides caught a draft, a faster current, a line of flight. And they were off, joined together like the ancient twins Castor and Pollux, the Dioscuri, half immortal, bodies whose destinies are fatally joined, making their way steadily toward a line of cirrus clouds in the distance. The ascent was gentle. Archimedes and Aerides coasted in the upward flow of a thermal gradient. Then they disappeared into blue sky, dissolving into two particles whose presence had been so palpably felt an hour earlier at the lake. Two delicate creatures sharing a common filamentary web. Two entities attracting an array of scientists, citizens, artists, and students invested in this atmospheric experiment. As we listened, Archimedes and Aerides drifting away from the hands and bodies that held them at the edge of the lake, it is important to note that these are unusual nomadic entities. Archimedes and Aerides appear to be balloons, but they are more like pneumatic chambers or absorbent lungs. They are hand-sewn from fabric, and they do not need helium or hydrogen. Rather, they gain buoyancy using only the heat of the sun. That is, by trapping the photons emanating from our planet's nearest star and entering the flows of air currents generated by the displacement of energy in Earth's atmosphere. And it is equally important that Archimedes and Aerides are part of an international artistic community called Aerocene. Aerocene emerged from the studio of artist Thomas Saraceno in Berlin, but the project now reaches into the worlds of citizen science, transportation policy, environmental justice, aerogeography, and degrowth architecture. In the past 2 years alone, Aerocene sculptures have featured in hacker and maker spaces, in excursions over the Italian Alps, in environmental justice campaigns in Buenos Aires, in a third-year geography course I teach here at Royal Holloway, and in indigenous-led actions against the extraction of lithium in the Salinas Grandes of Argentina. Crucial to Aerocene practices are careful processes of fabrication, preparation, and launch of Aerocene sculptures. However, because of their dependence on the air and the sun, the trajectories of Aerocene sculptures, like Archimedes and Aerides, are never assured or fully predicted. They are always partially unknown. The trajectories of Archimedes and Aerides are so unpredictable because they are governed by the ungovernable elements. In many traditions, the elements are not static substances, but are unruly energies and forces. In ancient Mesoamerican cosmology, for example, the world is composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. In sculptures and monuments, these elements are represented inside the symbol Olin, meaning movement or earthquake. A similar tetrarchal version of the elements is found in ancient Greece. In Chinese philosophy, however, the 5 elemental phases are earth, fire, water, metal, and wood. As Yuriko Furuhata writes, these elemental phases interact with each other in specific ways. Earth generates metal, while metal subjugates wood. Ancient Hindu philosophy foregrounds 3 important elements: fire, water, and earth, each of which is linked to different parts of and processes in the human body. Across different traditions, then, the elements are codes for movement and process. Yet the ancient elements were excluded from European science throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, in large part due to science's emphasis on classification and rational explanation, and the widespread sense that these older diagrams of the elements were regressive, anachronistic, and reductive. It is only recently that the cultural, imaginative, and political qualities of the elements have become important concerns for anthropologists, geographers, and humanities scholars once again. It is no accident that the 2 Eocene sculptures in this talk inherit their names from Greek myth and epic poetry. For Archimedes and Aerides move in ways that are foreign to a Boeing or an Airbus. Rather than moving against aerial elements, these 2 sculptures move with them. In doing so, they remind us that the atmosphere is not a series of neatly stacked and empty layers, but a lively material and topological zone. By intervening in the geographies of the air and by proposing different ways of perceiving, moving, and imagining, art can amplify the elemental dimensions of our collective worlds. The chase began, a sense of excitement, of thrill, of adventure, and equally of suspense and trepidation. Archimedes and Aerides were no longer immediately sensible, yet they communicated vital signs. They transmitted GPS location data and readings of temperature, pressure, and humidity inside and outside their membranes. They also transmitted images of the view from their lofty aerial position to a website where grounded practitioners could follow along. I was one of those grounded practitioners, refreshing the SSDV site for new images. I watched the wind farms and plains pass by as the sculptures drifted northeast. In this way, my sensory realm was extended. It was lured toward those distant airborne bodies whose capacity to float and to transmit information depended on the ecology of practices that had unfolded at the lake that morning. Dozens of hands had attached the radio antennas, air sensors, and cameras to the sculptures, double-checking each knot and battery. For these and other reasons, Archimedes and Aerides were not alone in the stratosphere. They carried dozens of other bodies along with them. From there onward, Archimedes and Aerides became a tiny red icon on a map of continental Europe. The map, made possible by the Automatic Position Reporting System technology, or APRS, works through a mixture of ground-based radio antennas and digital repeaters, which pick up the faint transmissions of the 2 sculptures like breadcrumbs on a trail. An eye gate listens to data transmitted on air and injects it into the internet stream, so that live APRS data can be viewed online from anywhere in the world. But Aerocene sculptures are not the only entities using the APRS network. Viewing the APRS map in any location reveals a multiplicity of moving entities, from high-altitude balloons to gliders, ships, sailboats, trucks, and passenger cars. A living inventory of wind, water, and fuel-driven nomads. The celebrated aeronaut Jeannette Piccard said of balloon journeys, "You don't file a flight plan. You go where the wind goes. You feel like part of the air. You almost feel like part of eternity, and you just float along." Archimedes and Aerides' journey is one of stillness and motion. Moving at the exact speed of the wind, the sculptures joined an elemental current. The traces left by these sculptures on the APRS map are also part of the air. Following Archimedes and Aerides' path on that hot summer day, it became possible to observe, even to feel, the curves, patterns, and twists of the atmosphere over a period of time, as well as the force of the sun in generating the potential for the sculpture's movements. For Megan Pralinger, the atmosphere holds, quote, "a cultural legacy of missteps and discoveries that press down on us from above," end quote. Pralinger echoes Karl Marx, who said on April 14, 1856 in London, quote, "The atmosphere in which we live weighs upon everyone with a 20,000-pound force, but do you feel it?" End quote. William Rankin quotes an American executive who asserted in 1927, quote, "that an airway is just as truly on the surface of the earth as is a railway," end quote. The infrastructures and laws of the air are not immaterial or evanescent. They weigh, press, and make marks upon earth. And they are maintained by unfair labor relations, social inequalities, and colonial legacies. Indeed, as geographer Wei Quang Lin shows, air traffic management manuals, quote, "overwhelmingly draw on Western, particularly North Atlantic, logics in aviation systems, surveillance techniques, and even weather patterns." In other words, European ideas of sky and weather are imposed globally through air traffic rules and aerial surveillance. This is a reworking of coloniality under the auspices of air passenger safety. It is a regime that assumes that there is one true relationship to the sky rather than many, one form of aerial movement rather than a plurality. A hopeful morning became a worried evening. The sun had set, therefore Archimedes and Aerides were surely earthbound. But the signal was lost. It had faded altogether. The chase team still traversed the dark forests and Great Lakes of Poland near the province of Augusto. It was likely at that point that the sculptures had fallen into water and were irretrievable. The chasers tried desperately to pick up the signal. A chance reception was the last remaining hope. The faraway searching for the sense of the sculptures, the search for a signal pulsing weakly through pine, landforms, herds of elk, stream, stone, and fog, was relayed to those in Berlin via sporadic texts and calls. Bodies formed postures that curled into themselves or slumped into grass. There were attempts to distract, to refocus, to worry less. We stared at the red balloon icon on the map, marking where it had last been sounded. All of this punctuated by animated retellings and glossed-over eyes, stories imparting how the sculptures had lifted into the air and the way they had hung, spectre-like, there, until the wind, as in myth, had carried them away. The journey of Archimedes and Aerides is not only a technical achievement, it is profoundly sensual, affective, and emotional. This sensuality extends beyond humans alone, to the devices, materials, and non-human entities implicated in Archimedes and Aerides' story. Take, for instance, the handheld radio antenna, poised to receive a vagrant signal from the sculptures, emanating through the thick darkness of the summer night. Or the packets of temperature, pressure, and image data transmitting from the airborne sculptures over vast expanses of horizon, atmosphere, and landscape, picking up textures of these landscapes along the way. And consider the sleepy, strained, and sunburnt bodies of those who prepared and launched the sculptures and followed their circuitous route. This elemental journey is a universe of feeling. Its value is located as much in affect and sensation as in altitude, distance, or data. Can one floating journey make a difference to the dominant paradigm of fossil fuel aeromobility or the colonial logics of aerial surveillance? Astrida Neimanis writes, quote, "The doing of an imaginary can't present an imaginary wholesale, but engages the work required to keep negotiating it and proposing it anew," end quote. The doing of one aerosolar journey cannot on its own represent a post-fossil society or a new set of aerial policies. But as a work of negotiating the atmospheric lawscape and proposing fuel-free, wind-borne mobility, an aerosolar journey is an effort in building a new political and elemental imaginary that keeps many bodies, both aerostatic and human, afloat. It is an experiment that draws power from the ancient histories of the elements and the collective tactics of art to propose counter-geographies of the air. Circa 11:50 p.m., a signal emerges. Adrian Krell and Thomas Kron hear the sculpture's unique call on a handheld radio receiver. They know they are within 3 kilometers. The signal recedes, they retrace their steps. Circa 1:18 a.m., Archimedes and Aerides are found. Adrian spotted the membranes slumped over a bush in a field. This news sparks collective elation. Calls and texts fly among phones at 2 a.m. Some feel intense relief, others pride, and others celebrate into the night. The sculptures are returned via car to Berlin. The journey of Archimedes and Aerides has already shifted from rumor to epic. A few days later, friends of the Aeroscene community gathered to hear a presentation of the journey of Archimedes and Aerides. As bodies assemble at the studio in East Berlin, Thomas Saraceno narrates the event. However, rather than showing spectacular pictures taken from the stratosphere during the sculpture's journey, he shows photos of the drive, the unfolding of membranes, numerous hands holding onto tethers, celebratory scenes at the launch site, and of waiting in his Berlin apartment. He shows the social, sensual, and affective texture of the event. And then he repeats, "We are relearning how to float in the air."